Edward Callaway had everything a man could want. He had a beautiful townhouse in the heart of Philadelphia, a career that other men envied, and a reputation that followed him into every room before he even opened his mouth. People called him the Duke, not because he had a title or came from royalty, but because of the way he carried himself. Straight back, calm eyes, a voice that never rushed. He moved through life as if he had already decided how every situation would end, and most of the time, he was right. On a cold December evening, Edward stood at the tall windows of his study and watched snow fall slowly over the street below. He had a glass of whiskey in his hand that he had not touched in 20 minutes. The fire behind him was warm. The room was quiet. From the outside, it looked like the life of a man who had figured everything out. But Edward knew the truth. The truth was that the house felt large in a way that had nothing to do with its size. The truth was that he had eaten dinner alone again, at a table built for 6, and had not minded, which bothered him more than minding would have. The truth was that somewhere in the years behind him, something important had gone missing, and he had been too proud to go back and look for it. His phone buzzed on the desk, a reminder from his assistant about a charity gala the following evening. He almost typed back to say he would not be attending. He had been to enough of those events to know exactly how they went. The same conversations. The same faces. The same polite smiles that meant nothing by midnight. He put the phone down without replying. He picked up his whiskey and finally drank. The gala was held in a grand hotel downtown, the kind of place with high ceilings and soft lighting that made everyone look slightly better than they were. Edward arrived late, on purpose, shook a few hands at the door, and made his way toward the far end of the room where the crowd was thinner. He accepted a drink from a passing tray and settled into the rhythm of the evening, half listening to a colleague talk about a new development project near the river. He was nodding along when he saw her. She was standing near the far wall, half turned away from him, speaking to a woman in a red dress. She was laughing at something the woman had said, a genuine laugh that came from somewhere real, not the kind people produce at events like this one. She was wearing a simple navy dress and no statement jewelry. She was not trying to be noticed. She had no idea he was in the room. Edward stopped talking mid-sentence. He knew that laugh. He had known that laugh when he was 26 years old, and the world felt like it was moving fast enough to carry him wherever he pointed himself. He had known that laugh on a rooftop in the summer, in a small kitchen on a Sunday morning, in the passenger seat of his car on a drive that went nowhere in particular, because neither of them had wanted it to end. Marguerite de Saulnier. Everyone called her Mara. She had left Philadelphia 9 years ago, and Edward, to his great and lasting shame, had let her go. He stood still for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he set his drink on a nearby table and walked across the room. She saw him when he was still a few steps away. Something moved across her face, quick and controlled, like a door opening and closing before you could see inside. Then she settled into a calm, even expression that was polite and warm and gave nothing away. "Edward," she said. "Mara," he said. There was a pause that neither of them rushed to fill. Then she introduced him to her friend, who excused herself graciously after a minute, the way people do when they sense they have walked into the edge of something private. They talked. It was careful at first, the way conversations are between two people who once knew each other very well and are now navigating how much of that knowing still applies. She told him she was back in Philadelphia. She had been for almost 4 months. She was working on a new documentary, locally based this time. She had a small apartment in Fishtown and a dog named Cartier, which made her smile when she said it, because the name was ridiculous and she knew it. He asked if he could call her sometime. She looked at him for a moment, with those steady eyes he had never forgotten. "Sure, Edward," she said. Not a yes, not a no, something honest in the middle. He drove home that night without turning on the radio. To understand what Edward felt standing in that ballroom, you have to go back 14 years. You have to go back to a rooftop dinner in July, when a mutual friend had seated them next to each other almost by accident, and Mara de Saulniers had spent the first 10 minutes of the meal arguing politely but firmly with something Edward had said about documentary filmmaking, which she knew about, and he did not. He had been surprised. He was not used to being corrected, and he was even less used to enjoying it. They talked for the rest of the evening. When the group moved inside, they stayed on the roof. When the roof got cold, they moved to a diner around the corner and ordered coffee, and sat there until the coffee was gone, and then sat there some more. He walked her to her door at 2 in the morning, and neither of them made any dramatic gestures about it. He just said goodnight, and she said goodnight, and they both went home, and he thought about her for 3 days straight. They fell into each other the way some people do, easily and completely, without a formal beginning. She was a documentary filmmaker who cared deeply about the stories she told. She read books on the subway. She had opinions about everything, and delivered them without apology, but also without cruelty. She made him laugh in ways that surprised him, from somewhere low and real, not the practiced chuckle he used in meetings. And she saw him clearly. That was the thing he had never been able to find again in anyone else. Mara looked at him, without being impressed by the things that impressed other people, and without being put off by the things he usually had to keep hidden. She saw the version of him that existed underneath the confidence and the reputation, and the carefully maintained distance, and she did not look away. They were together for 3 years. Though together was a word, Edward always kept slightly soft, always left a little undefined. He told himself it was because he was busy, because he was still building something and needed focus. The real reason, the one he would not look at directly for many years, was that needing someone frightened him in a way that nothing else did. He could handle risk in business. He could handle competition, failure, long odds. But the idea of being the person who wanted more, who needed more, who could be left, was something he had quietly and consistently refused to allow. So he kept things comfortable. He kept things unspoken. And Mara, who was patient but not foolish, waited longer than she should have for him to say out loud what they both already knew was true. She asked him directly, one evening in the fall. They were sitting in her apartment after dinner, and she turned to him with a calm that he recognized only later as a kind of courage, and she asked him what they were, what he wanted this to be. He said something careful, something that acknowledged how much she meant to him while managing to commit to absolutely nothing. He watched her face as he spoke. He watched her absorb his words and process them, and arrive, quietly, at an answer she had probably been preparing herself for. She nodded slowly. She said she understood. 6 months later, she told him she had accepted a fellowship in Lyon, France. She would be gone for at least 2 years, possibly longer. She said it calmly, over coffee, on a Tuesday morning, and she looked at him the whole time she was talking, and he understood, even then, even through all his armor, that she was giving him one last opening, that she was waiting to see if he would finally say the thing he had been refusing to say. He told her it was a wonderful opportunity. He said he was proud of her. He meant both things completely, and he also knew they were not the right things, and he said them anyway. She left in March. He drove her to the airport. He carried 2 of her bags to the curb. They hugged for a long moment at the departure doors, long enough that it felt like something, but not long enough to be a scene. She pulled back and looked at him and said, "Take care of yourself, Edward." He said, "You too." He watched her walk through the doors and disappear into the crowd inside. He stood on the curb for a moment longer than necessary. Then he got back in his car and drove to work. He told himself, for years, that he was fine. And in the practical ways, he was. His company grew. He traveled. He dated women who were accomplished and interesting, and who eventually grew tired of the particular distance he maintained, the polite wall that looked like calm, but was actually something else entirely. He was married once, briefly, to a woman named Caroline, who told him on the way out that she felt like she had never quite reached him, that there was always a room inside him with the door closed, and she was tired of knocking. He heard through mutual friends that Mara had extended her time in Europe, that her films were doing well, winning recognition at festivals, being shown in cities he had visited for other reasons, and somehow never gone to look for her work. He heard she had been in a relationship for a few years, something serious, and that it had ended, and that she seemed all right. He looked her up once. He would not have admitted it to anyone. A documentary she had made about displaced families had gotten a small release at an art house cinema across town. He bought a ticket for a Tuesday afternoon showing and sat in the 3rd row from the back, alone in a nearly empty theater, and watched for 90 minutes as the world she saw came through the screen. She was in it briefly, her voice more often than her face, asking quiet questions that made people open up in ways they probably had not expected. It was a beautiful film. He sat through the credits. He never told anyone he had gone. And then she was standing across a ballroom in a navy dress, laughing genuinely at something someone had said, and 9 years collapsed into nothing. He called her 3 days after the gala. She answered on the second ring. They met for coffee that Saturday, at a place she had chosen in her neighborhood, small and warm, with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu. She came in with snow on her coat and a calm, open expression, and they sat for 2 hours and talked like people who had once been very close and were now carefully, honestly, figuring out what remained. She was funny. She had always been funny, but there was a lightness to her now that had not always been there, the particular ease of someone who had moved through something difficult and come out on the other side with better footing. She told him about Lyon, about the villages in southern France she had filmed, about the year she spent mostly in silence after her relationship ended, and how she had come back to Philadelphia, not running away from anything but genuinely drawn back. They met again 2 weeks later, for dinner, and then for a long walk along the river on a Sunday, when the cold was sharp but the sky was clear. It was on that walk that she told him honestly what those years had been like. She said she had been angry at him for a long time. Not dramatic anger, not the kind that makes scenes, but a quiet, persistent anger that came from having loved someone who would not meet her halfway. She said she had eventually realized she had been angry at herself too, for staying in something that was not going to give her what she needed, for waiting for a signal that was never going to come. She said she had forgiven him. She said it plainly, without making a gift of it, simply stating a fact about where she had arrived. Edward listened to all of it without defending himself. That was new. The old version of him would have managed the conversation, would have subtly redirected or offered a reasonable explanation. He just listened. Then he told her the truth. He said that letting her go was the worst mistake of his life. He said it without rehearsal, standing on a path beside the river with the cold coming off the water, looking directly at her. He said he had loved her, genuinely loved her, and had spent years refusing to admit it to himself, because admitting it would have meant being vulnerable in a way that terrified him. He said he was not telling her this because he expected anything from it. He was telling her because he was 44 years old, and he was finally done carrying the lie that it had not happened the way it happened. Mara looked at him for a long time. The river moved quietly beside them. Somewhere behind them a dog barked and its owner called after it. She said, "I know, Edward. I think I always knew." They walked back in a silence that was not uncomfortable. In the weeks that followed, they stayed in each other's lives with a care that felt different from anything Edward had practiced before. There were no grand promises made. There were dinners and phone calls, and one afternoon, when she brought Cartier to the park near his house, and the dog investigated everything within reach, while they sat on a bench and talked about nothing particularly important, and everything that mattered. Edward did not know what it would become. For the first time in his life, he found that he could hold that uncertainty without needing to resolve it immediately. What he did know was this: he had spent the better part of 20 years believing that staying untouched was the same as staying strong. He had built his whole life around control, around managing his distance from anything that could reach him. He had called it ambition, called it focus, called it being realistic, and it had cost him the one thing that had ever felt truly real. He sat in his study late one evening, the same chair, the same window, the city outside moving slowly through a winter night. He picked up his phone and typed a message to Mara. He asked if Cartier was still available for that Saturday walk. 3 small dots appeared on the screen, then her reply came through. "Saturday, 10 in the morning. Do not be late." He set the phone down on the desk. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft and quiet over the street below. He looked at it for a long moment. Then, for the first time and longer than he could honestly remember, Edward Callaway smiled.